stats and talking to Professor Rudolf Zinn of UNISA, so at least one of the other universities on the line. But let's get to what's been happening this past week. And as I said, not much good news. And if you look at the front page of Sunday Times today, if I could quote it to you there, it says that COVID-19 rips the ANC apart. And Theo and Piet, just taking it from there, not good news, and behind that headline, a lot of bad news.
Yeah, I was hoping Theo would start off this, because I read a WhatsApp group this week, and he's got some very interesting ideas about it. Theo, would you just like to introduce it then?
Yeah. I'm from the business school of the Northwest University, situated in Potchefstroom. And interesting thing about COVID-19, and that is that whether it's South Africa, whether it's the US, and whether it's Italy, whether it's England, it will have a political impact in some way or another. And the one thing that none of the countries were prepared for was, if you flatten the curve, it's one thing, but over time, this virus acts in very much the same way. When it peaks, everything basically falls apart. I know South Africans are highly cynical and critical of the government's efforts to put things in place, to have enough beds, to have enough ventilators. But remember, the same applied to New York at the height, and the same applied to Italy at the height. Therefore, I don't want to compare South Africa with those countries and kind of make something out of it. All I want to say is the playing fields are fairly even when this thing hits. And it will come in waves. There's no doubt about it. There's definitely a first wave, a second wave, and so on. But let's focus on the political impact. In Gauteng especially, there is a lot of things going wrong within the management of COVID. There are things such as corruption within COVID. If we can compare the COVID pandemic in the US, we had a movement within COVID, and that was the Black Lives Matter movement. But in South Africa, we've got corruption within COVID. In other words, things are going horribly wrong. And if things go wrong that way, what people expect is some form of reaction and some form of somebody that will pay the price. And I think in Gauteng, Premier Makura is under serious pressure at the moment, and we know at the moment Lesofie Panyazu is acting premier in the province, and if some groups in the ANC within Gauteng, especially those that's associated with Paul Machetile, if they have their way, then Makura will probably be out as premier in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I think it's often been said that COVID has exposed our inequalities, and it has exposed the racial divisions in South Africa. You think about Black Lives Matter, it was also part of our COVID process or COVID experience. But I think there's another thing that is not exposed, but is just emphasized, and that is what we see, what is happening in Gauteng, and the extent to which the COVID resources are distributed or redistributed, if you wish, to cadres within the ANC, or aligned to the ANC, or connected to the ANC, or to families within the ANC. It's not a new thing. It's been going on for decades. That's how the ANC sustained itself. This level, there's a layer of cadre, call them capitalists if you wish, because I think the capitalists will be very angry with me, because these people are really they pilfer, they slowly suffocate the state by just extracting the resources of the state, and they have the pretense, they look like capitalists, they look like free marketeers, they look like somebody who can provide services if only you give them the contract, or if only they get the tender. But it's actually an additional layer of authority that exists between the Lutuliers, or between the ANC and the government. And the Lutuliers has been highly reliant on these individuals to sustain itself. It's no coincidence that over the few months, Lutuliers can't really pay salaries, or they battle to pay salaries. It's because I think since Ramaphosa came, there was a tendency from the Auditor General, from the Minister of Finance, and from the President to start suffocating this bleeding of state resources by insisting on better controls, etc. So I honestly think that what has been exposed is the ANC to a large degree, and I can't put my finger on it, where the sudden reaction against corruption that comes from the integrity committees of the ANC, whether it's part of faction fighting, or that I think that's what Q is insinuated, or whether it's an honest attempt to, in some other way, clear up the ANC in the face of the IMF, which says that we will not give you funding beyond these billions that we gave you. If you want more funding, and Tito Mboweni already said we need more funding, we will approach the IMF and the World Bank for more funding. They will say, if you need more funding, this has to stop. So to me, it's uncertain. I'm not sure exactly what is happening. But what I do know is the ANC takes a massive battering. We will have an election next year. I think it'll be very hard for them to postpone it. And I think we will see even a lower percentage of people just being prepared to participate in the election.
But what we've seen today in the newspapers again, and coming up to it, clearly factions forming, reports of fights, a bumping of heads between the president and Ace Magashule. And then underlying all that, there's their children, the sons of the president and Ace Magashule, involved in all sorts of PPE supplying and things that have been question marked as far as honesty and integrity is concerned. Do you?
Cobus, yes. Peter has spoken at a certain level of the ANC. Let me talk to a level that I know very well and that I've been involved in for a very long time, and that is the local government level. And it doesn't look very different from the provincial level or the national level, except at the local level, it is clear to link the tenderpreneurs, those guys that are in on corruption, to link that to the survivability of the ANC, financially speaking, at the lowest level. The way in which they finance the branches, the way in which they finance certain actions is exactly by doing that. And then it scales up to province, and it scales up. And then you have nepotism. Now, let's listen to Ace Magashule. Ace Magashule says he doesn't know what his two sons are doing. He's not involved in the tender process, and he did not provide them with any of the millions of jobs they got in the Free State. That is true. That is on paper. But informally, and Pete will also tell you, the politics is not about what is on paper. The politics is, and power relationships are not necessarily written in paper. They are in relationships. They are in kind of control mechanisms. They are in many other things. And we know that, for instance, the Premier of the Free State is part of the extended Magashule, let's call it, sphere of influence. And you don't need to be on paper. What happens in government, and I've personally experienced it, you will get a call and it will tell you, you must tender for this, that, and the other. And then the next moment, when you provide those tenders, because you were aware and you were made aware in advance, the next moment they'll tell you at what amount. And then you will get the job. You will do part of the job. But in over-factoring, in over-invoicing, whatever you're doing, that's how the money erodes and filters out. And I think that is an illness within the ANC, and it is right through the ANC. I know personally, I think the president was unaware of the Bosasa money that went to his campaign in 2017. Let's give him that. But that shows you how high it goes, and his son was not innocent in this whole story, and his name is also cropping up. And what the Integrity Committee is doing is trying to play a role by advising, like they're doing now with the Deputy Minister of Finance. And I don't think that's good enough. The Integrity Committee must, if they want to do something different for the ANC, because in that sense, I agree with Pete. Unless they do something serious, they're in for a hiding in next year's local government elections. And the Integrity Commission would be one of those instruments that they can use if they act stronger and with more resolve.
Cobus, just to give you an idea how stupid they think we are. The government needs PPE. They can buy directly from the suppliers, but they buy it from a middleman who has never in his entire life owned a mask or any of the other PPE. In other words, somebody sits there and he goes and now he go and look for PPE, and then he acts as a middleman and he pockets millions in the process. There is no reason for government to approach these individuals to supply it. They can source it directly from the suppliers. There's absolutely no reason why. And if they want to use a middleman, because in America they have the same problem, the states they have the same problem that governments source this stuff through middlemen. If they have to source it through middlemen, why don't they source it through somebody that's in the business of selling PPE? In other words, you can say, you own PPE, we're going to buy it from you at the lowest possible price to government. That's how business is being done. And we talk about these things as if it's normal for somebody to walk into your door and steal as much as possible in a business contract between you and the next person. There is no reason why Nomvula Mokonyane's daughter should be in the middle, or Ace Magashuli's son should be in the middle. They have no expertise in trading with PPEs. They just have expertise in pilfering from the state and then putting it in their pockets and then providing a bad to no service.
But now,
but Pete, I differ here. I differ with Pete on this one. Although they have no business, there I agree. But what they do have, they've got BEE. And if you look at how government supply chain works, BEE is a very important component. And I think government is corrupting BEE themselves. BEE in principle is a good thing, but by utilizing it in this way, they're undermining their own policy.
But we keep on talking about the Integrity Committee, and I just want to get back to them for a moment and their role in this whole affair, because looking at the story today in Sunday Times as well, how clean are their hands, the people sitting on the Integrity Committee, or are they simply another faction, or maybe representing let's say, for instance, the Zuma faction, because we've had Mrs. Sisulu, or Ms. Sisulu coming in, Minister Sisulu, prominently, and also saying, yes, but now remember, I mean, she and David Mabuza were opponents at one stage, vying for the same job. And she's now insisting that Mabuza was never exonerated for things he allegedly did in Mpumalanga, and that all this must now come to a head. And one just gets the feeling that that's the front, but this is coming from a different direction, from people who had their noses out of joint in the first place because Mabuza helped Cyril Ramaphosa to become president.
Cobus, there was an interesting thing with the NEC meeting over the last few days, and that was the proposal. And I think, if I understand correctly, the News 24 journalist Hunter, unfortunately, I swallow so hard on the stories, because in the past he tended to exaggerate it, so a few things which undermine the source usually that she works for. But okay, be that as it may, her argument was that, and I think she said that it was the idea was mentioned at the NEC meeting that Kgalema Motlanthe must in some other way start to investigate say all this corruption around the ANC, maybe more focused on COVID-19, because I think broader than that, there are many commissions already investigating it. It was interesting that they say, well, somebody else can do it. Why not the Integrity Commission? Well, I think there's general agreement that the Integrity Commission has also been fractured, and it's difficult to find sufficient consensus about who should be investigated and what should the results be and what should happen. And also the Integrity Commission doesn't really have the authority to really act. They make sort of recommendations and stuff, but they don't have real power. And if you get the Kgalema Motlanthe to investigate the matter, and that report, instead of going to the ANC, can then go to the NPA and the Hawks, then we're talking business. But as you will have noticed in the newspapers, that was almost impossible to reach consensus about it. And it looks like that won't fly. But that tells you something about the Integrity Commission and the standing of the Commission within the ANC.
Well, there's also reports that...
Can I just add?
Certainly.
Cobus, can I just add to what Pete just said? Again, I'm at the point where I was earlier on, and that is what is on paper and what happens in the real world. And the real world is what we refer to as the political dynamics. If the Integrity Commission sits, and I must agree, it's veterans sitting there, it's people with integrity sitting there, most of them. But once they finish their report on whatever they've done, they must then present the report to nobody other than the Secretary General of the political party, which is Ace Magashule. And that is in that process, from taking the report from the Integrity Commission to the Secretary General, to the execution of it, that everything falls down. So in that sense, the Integrity Commission's line function is corrupted by having Ace Magashule in that line.
So what do you make of Ms. Sisulu's wish that the Integrity Committee should have the same status, basically, as the Constitutional Court? That, to me, I found funny or strange in any case for that. I wasn't sure that she had any idea of differentiating between state and the other authorities and the party.
Yeah, if there's investigation, if there's investigation, there's a report. The shortcut will be to go take it to the Hawks National Prosecuting Authority or the police to investigate the thing properly. And then once there's a prosecution, then you can go to another court and to appeal court and go to the Constitutional Court if you wish. But the direct route will be that these things must be investigated by the Hawks. But I think what bothers me is just when I say it was, you will see that Gigaba also managed to get the Hawks onto his his wife, and there's a deputy minister that managed to get the Hawks to arrest his wife, his ex-wife, or his girlfriend at least. So it looks like the girlfriend, girlfriend. So it looks like the Hawks, they are incredibly efficient when a minister calls them. And well, when Shamila Batoy talks about them, she says, well, they don't have the resources really to do what they should be doing. Look, if what we need is in South Africa, we cannot catch all these criminals. There are literally thousands of thousands from local government level, provincial government level, central government. They are everywhere. But what we need, if we can get one or two or three of the really big guns to appear in court, we need Ace Magashule to appear in court. We need Malusi Gigaba to appear in court. There should be some consequences for some members of the ANC and some members of the party. But we need to see them in court. It need to happen soon. Then I think the behavior of the smaller fish will also change. If the big fish goes to jail, the little fish will stop stealing too.
Talking about that, Theo, your own premier in Northwest, Job Mokgoro, quoted this week as being shocked and dismayed at how crooked things are below him, and people working for the province, people in responsible positions. And I must admit, I've always had the impression that Mr. Mokgoro himself is a straight shooter. very worrying that he seems to be in a position where he now realizes that he can't really control his own province.
Jacobus, I think it's a very important point, and it goes to the point that we've discussed earlier on. Yes, Job Mokgoro is a well-educated and a well-qualified manager at the provincial level. But what we see here is what we see in the rest of the country, and that is during the Zuma years, the institutionalization of corruption, especially in light of the paralysis with the Scorpions and then the Hawks and so on, developed at a level that nobody thought it's possible. Now the same happened in Northwest, because you will remember the previous premier, Supramaya Mapelu, was part of the Premier League that incorporated not only himself, but Ace Magashule and our Deputy President, Didi Mabuza, who on its own makes up a very interesting story at the moment. But what happened over that same period in the Northwest is when you've got the premiership, you've got a lot of power at the provincial level, and you've got the power of appointment, you've got the power of policy, you've got the power of implementation. There's a lot of things that you can do. So over a period of 2 terms, Supramaya Mapelu appointed a lot of people that is still loyal to him, politically and otherwise. And I think Job Mokgoro realized very early on that he may have confidence in a few people around him, but the moment you go into the bureaucracy, there sits a lot of people with different interests, and they still operate the same way they did under Maya Mapelu. And what happened to our premier, very similar to what happened in Gauteng. When Gordon Kegakilwe died of COVID about 2-3 weeks ago, immediately the Supra guys jumped onto the bandwagon saying, since Kegakilwe had contact with Job Mokgoro and so on, and Job eventually tested positive, but he wasn't that ill, we must now have an acting premier. Job Mokgoro cannot be premier if he's ill. Eventually he battled that and isolated in a hospital ward in Gauteng so as to get distance from these political hyenas that was surrounding him. And I think the same situation in Gauteng at the moment, where COVID provides a situation where changes in leadership is now being done. And that changes is not necessarily between the old Zuma guard and the new Ramaphosa guard. It is sometimes also within the Ramaphosa group, such as in Gauteng, where the ambitions of Paul Machetile to become the next deputy president and to oust somebody like Didi Mabuza, due to several other reasons, becomes part of the play that we now see of people that got suspended and people high up in the office of the president and so on. So COVID not only added to the level of corruption, it also added a lot to the political infighting within the ANC, which is kind of the Sunday Times story.
So Didi Mabuza, last weekend on this program, we were talking about the fact that he's been reported as being very ill, and that there's been a lot of speculation about him possibly being on his way out through no choice of his own. Any truth in that so far? Theo, I'm staying with you. Any idea, any indication that we might indeed have a fight for that chair within the foreseeable future?
There's no doubt that Didi Mabuza is an ill man. He has had previous problems with his health, but the best information that I've got is that he's not taken down by COVID-19. It's a different illness about which people are very secretive. But what is also true about Didi Mabuza, he lost a lot of political capital when he moved from the Premier League to the Ramaphosa guys in the last hours of the Nasrec conference. What I pick up at the moment is that he's trying to rebuild some form of alliance, and it is aptly called the third way. And the third way is kind of to get the good guys, if I can call them that, within the NDZ campaign to come back to him so that he can mobilize them again. Because remember, everybody is looking not only at the local government elections that are about, let's say, 9 months, 6 months away, depending on what the IEC decides. But within the next 18 months to 2 years, we've got the next presidential election in the ANC. In other words, guys are already gearing towards that eventuality that takes, I think, Pete, in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, December of 2022. But somewhere in the not too distant future, we will have a battle in the ANC again.
They tried to postpone that date to because that 6 months delay, or that period of delay between the ANC leadership election and the national election, seemed to cause all sorts of troubles within the ANC. But I think that, just to return to Didi Mabuza, I think he was mortally wounded about a year and a half ago when he was informed by the ANC that should Cyril Ramaphosa not feel very well this morning, and when he gets up, or if something happens to him, heaven forbids, Mabuza won't become the next president of South Africa automatically. There will be a return to the National Assembly, and the National Assembly will, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma will be proposed by, or suggested, or elected by the ANC as the next president, because she was the contender at the leadership conference, and Didi Mabuza will remain deputy president. And if he wishes to become president, he will have to do so at the next leadership election. He will have to campaign for that position. I think that more or less settled it, that Didi Mabuza is not going to become president of the ANC ever, and will never become president of the country. And also, I think these things that we talked about, I think he's lost a lot of political steam. There are other contenders now building up better alliances in the front row, I think, of the battle. I think Didi Mabuza, he disappears for long periods of time. It's not the first time that he would, sometimes for months you don't hear, and then he returns a bit, and he appears in Parliament, they answer questions, then he disappears for 2 months. And it could be due to ill health, or he could be visiting Russia for treatment, etc. But the fact remains, he seems to disappear from the political scene from time to time. And then I also know that the president, at times, in a way, as a means of a way of getting him involved, or just boosting his ego, but will involve him again in decision making. But then he will disappear gradually out of the scene. So I think he's coming and going. I don't think there's a lot of dynamics to his effort to return in terms of a third way. And I think there are other contenders, Paul Mashatile and a whole lot of other people who have really, really big political ambitions that will make sure that he doesn't, he will not win another leadership contest for the deputy president in 2022. No.
What do you make? I don't think we need to spend too much time on this, but on Friday, as a result of all this stuff going on and the negative reporting that's been going on about the ANC, we saw the ANC launch a I Love ANC campaign on Twitter, and they were very harshly dealt with by the other Twitterati. Must we read much out of that, or is it just Twitter?
No, don't read anything into Twitter. If you believe Twitter, then the EFF is the majority party in South Africa. So don't read much into Twitter. But the idea of the campaign is, I think it's a good idea to try to sanitize, because the ANC has taken a massive battering over the last few months. Remember when the lockdown came, Minister Mkhize was extremely popular, and the president was, I think there was a report in the whole lot of newspapers at surveys, and it was proven that the president is very popular among black and white and DA supporters even. So at the time, the ANC was almost ironically, by the interim, when COVID started, was on the crest of the wave. And since then, the decline was rather steep, and it was steep for Boris Johnson. It was steep down for Donald Trump. There's now a real chance that Donald Trump will lose a next election in America. And it has got a lot to do with COVID. There's a real chance that the ANC will battle in the next election. It will have a lot to do with COVID. Boris Johnson will be in trouble, and it's got a lot to do with COVID. COVID is really a great equalizer for politicians. It cuts them down to size in remarkable ways, looks like.
Well, talking about that, if one looks at, if we can step off the internal politics for a while, but looking at the way COVID situations are being managed, has been managed over the past 3 months, almost 4 months now. And a disturbing story again this morning in the newspapers. A week ago, the courts ordered that the ANC must feed hungry children. Nothing in that line has happened so far, apparently. And now we read also that a group of volunteer pilots, chopper pilots in Mpumalanga, have been flying vital foodstuffs and other materials to people in remote areas, about 10,000 people affected by this, remote areas of Mpumalanga. And they've now been forbidden to do it because of red tape. It seems as though it's a question of civil aviation not being up to date with their bureaucracy and giving out the licenses required. Did any one of you pick up on that?
Well, Cobus, yeah. Let me first say that we knew from the start that South Africa's challenge will be hunger, not so much the virus. The virus will be big, but since the levels of poverty in this country is high, and like Pete already said, COVID amplified existing problems, hunger being one of them. And even the court case about feeding schemes, how on earth are you going to do a feeding scheme when children are not at school? In other words, you must now take the food to their individual dwellings or houses or wherever. And I think that is a bridge too far for current infrastructure. That will not happen in that way. So I'm worried about that court decision. It's not one that can be easily implemented. I've been involved in some form of food distribution, and I can speak with a little bit of experience. This is not easy. And the biggest challenge remain logistics. So doing and using a helicopter is a very fine way of doing it. It cuts a lot of roadblocks and things like that. And yes, red tape sometimes. What's funny to me about emergency situations, and remember, we're still in an emergency at the third level of our emergency. One of the things that governments do under emergency situations is to cut the red tape, is to shorten the supply link. That's where the corruption came from. To do several things quicker rather than the normal bureaucratic way. But it seems to me some departments, some institutions hasn't caught on to the problem yet. And again, my view is this is a lack of leadership. Our president is a very good leader, but he's a specific type of leader, and that is a leader that's looking and searching for consensus all the way. Now, if I can take a rugby metaphor and I apply it to Cyril Ramaphosa, it's fine to play the game conventionally, to search for consensus, to get the ball from the scrum, to pass it down the back line. But sometimes you must take the shortcut. Sometimes you must break around the scrum, like some of our new scrum halves can do so well. And it seems to me Ramaphosa don't have that short game. And it's going to be very detrimental to him in the long term. He needs to develop a short game quicker rather than longer.
In the meantime, we have no idea whether the matrics are returning to school, apparently. There's a lot of confusion about whether they're going back to school tomorrow, because it's not been gazetted yet, the way I understand it. But I want you, for a moment, just to tip your hat, because despite all the problems we've had, despite the disruption of the school system, all these things, there's one little school in the northern parts of this country, the Dendron Secondary School, who featured in a story this morning. And these kids have had the same problems as all other people, I think, except that they had teachers and parents who got together and solved the problem. And by June this year, they'd already finished the curriculum for matric. And they're ready to go and write exams. Why this type of reaction on one side from a school that's not one of the rich schools in this country, but for the rest of it, we're in a shambles.
Cobus, there's a lot of schools who are finished with the curriculum. There's a lot of schools who can write the September exam, and they can also write the December exam. What we do not know is we do not know how many schools cannot do it. And there was this urban legend, because I've never seen the facts, but I have no reason to doubt it. There was this legend that 75% of schools in South Africa is dysfunctional. If that is true, then it will be the same issue here. 75% of the schools will not be ready for the September exam, and 75% will not be ready for the December exam. I cannot see how these schools, being dysfunctional, suddenly manage to complete the curriculum and manage to get their matrics to write exams. I don't think the playing field is going to be level. And I suspect there might still politics be in this thing as we approach the exam, because it will be a legitimate argument if the unions argue that most kids are not prepared for the December exam and they didn't have the same opportunities as those kids who had Wi-Fi and Zoom classes, etc. So I think the politics of what is going to happen in the exam is still coming. But I must admit, it is absolutely remarkable of how many schools I do know that have managed through all this to complete the curriculum, and they are busy with the revision for the end of the year exams. What happens from grade 11 to grade 8 to 7 to 6 and 5, there is a minefield. And I think we will have to fix it over a 2 or 3 year program, as opposed to fixing the problems this year or even fixing it next year. But as far as the matrics is concerned, I think there's still some politics in the pipeline. I cannot see how the unions will agree to that these children from the 75% or 7% dysfunctional schools write the same exam, because it will reflect horribly on those schools, the teachers there, as well as the headmasters of those schools, etc.
The big question, of course, that comes up then is also that when you say we've got 75% dysfunctional schools, and you look at the fact that for the past 25 years, we have put an enormous percentage of our annual budget into education, and we still have 75% dysfunctional schools. It's another thing that the ANC will have to answer for.
Yeah, I think if you look at that,
absolutely.
That you go on.
No, I want to confirm what Cobus said, and we have been warned by the IMF and the World Bank that we spend too much on education in terms of what we get out of education. And it is probably the worst investment in our current budget. And I know education is a crucial thing. Both Peter and myself are in education, and we know how important it is. But the way in which we spend money and the way in which we manage our education system is not a very good use of 20 cents in each rand.
If you look at the budget, the budget of Tito Mboweni, this emergency budget, as I like to call it, you know where he got the money from that he redistributed to COVID? Those that we didn't borrow from abroad. He got it from the education budget. And he took it and he gave it to local government budget, where all the corruption is happening in South Africa. That's the heart of the corruption, is local government level and some at provincial government level. He took it from education. Universities will next year be in enormous problems. It will not be possible for them to balance their budgets next year, because of the money has been taken away from them. And there's no sign of that money being returned ever again. Universities will have to completely redesign the way they do business. And I've heard from some universities, I don't want to mention them, that already they said for the next 3 years there won't be any increases. And then it's possible that they will try to convince the staff that there won't be December bonuses, etc. The state took money from education, where it's badly spent, and it's moved it to local government level, where it's even worse, spent in a worse way. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, does it?
Well, I think we're going to end that part of the program right here, and just say that, whatever you heard today, please don't jump off any buildings or split your wrists. Maybe we'll have better news next week. But now we're going to another very worrying factor. I'm sorry, it's another bad news piece, and that is the latest crime statistics that that have been exposed to the country or reported to the country. And we welcome on the program now Rudolf Zinn, Professor Rudolf Zinn, who is part of the staff at UNISA. He's on the faculty there, and one of the country's foremost experts when it comes to crime and things related to crime in this country. And I almost sounded as though I was describing a politician here, but in any case, Rudolf, welcome this afternoon. And looking at, just to start with, looking at the figures that came out, really nothing to cheer about.
No, definitely not, Cobus. If you're an optimist, then you would probably go for the angle that the total number of crimes reported to the police in the last financial year decreased with 4.7%. But I'm more of the opinion it's most probably due to a lack of confidence in the criminal justice system that people are reporting less of these offences. But our big problem in South Africa with the violent crime remains the issue at the moment.
I'm opening this to the panel. Piet?
Let me just ask you this question, Rudolf, and that's one that's it's a big issue again now, and it's the issue of farm murders in South Africa. Perhaps, and there is a massive spike of crime on farms, and it has consequences for human lives, etc. If you look at what's happening over the last 3 or 4 weeks with the sudden spike in farm murders, and you look at the crime statistics, is it possible to separate the two and say the one is a different phenomenon from the other one? I think some people will argue crime, farm murders, has got a very specific set of attributes and it should be differently judged. Or is it? Can you explain it in the context of the crime spike in South Africa in general?
But I think what we're seeing happening at the farms is actually happening across the board. When I did interviews a few years ago with the incarcerated offenders of house robberies, most of them were incarcerated in the Gauteng prisons, but to my surprise, 25% of them admitted to being involved in farm attacks as well. And I'm currently busy doing research in the Free State correctional facilities, interviewing these incarcerated offenders for farm attacks. And they also admit to be involved in carjacking, business robbery, street robbery, etc. So it's not that you get a separate group of people who would only commit robberies at farms, but these are career robbers, criminals, who would, deciding on where the biggest risk or biggest advantage would be for them, they would go and actually commit the robberies there. So I think the farms are seen to be isolated at the moment. They're not part of the hotspots as far as COVID-19 is concerned and operations in that respect. So probably left aside, an easy target at the moment.
So if I can just ask you one more question about that. The reference being made to these farmers being particularly brutal and there being torture involved, etc. A few years ago, I was involved in something else and I read dockets that came from Alexandra and it looked like farm murders. They were, the young children were forced to rape their mothers. People were brutalized for hours on end in small shacks. And it the same pattern to me, but it's not a very political, a popular thing to say, but it doesn't look like what is happening on farms is anyway different from what you will see, for instance, in urban crime sometimes.
I fully agree. What I've seen with the robbers is, if you speak to them, they say they've got more time in the farm robbery. They can actually see a vehicle approaching the farm to come and assist. So they know it's isolated and they stay longer inside the farmhouse. And it gives them the opportunity to commit these secondary crimes. But you're quite right. In the house robberies, we saw exactly the same. And what I'm a bit disappointed about If you look at the current statistics that were released by the police, they went to the trouble to give a list of the biggest number of murder cases in South Africa, as well as rapes. And you would see that in one particular case, a person murdered 9 individuals. And they gave a whole list of others that did more or less 7 or 8 murders per crime. And there's an example of a lady that was raped by 20 rapists in a incident, one specific incident. If you speak to these offenders, as far as the brutality is concerned, even motor vehicle hijacking, you find the same. I think our biggest problem in South Africa, we've got a brutality. It's not necessarily even a violence issue. It's more than that.
But it's
I
also,
wanted to ask you,
you can commit 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 crimes before you see a policeman for the first time. In America, if you commit your second or your third crime, the police will be on top of you. In South Africa, you can commit crime for years, for 2 years, for 3 years, before you, in some other way, clash with the law first time, isn't it?
I picked in the 2003, 2008, and now this round of interviews with incarcerated robbers, on average, they had committed about 103 to 105 serious offences before they were arrested for the first time. And that's usually over 5 to 7 years. So these are people that get away with crime for a very long, long time. And they continue to become more aggressive, more violent, because they become more experienced and they see there are no consequences.
but there seems to be 2 issues
Rudolf,
here. One is
few-
that, sorry, Theo, just let me, what we're seeing is on the one side, the violence and the way people are tortured and murdered. And one would like to know whether there's been any research into why the brutality, where does that come from? And then the other issue to me, it's often been said that, people say bring back the death penalty because it's a deterrent. I say, and I know a lot of other people say, it's not the punishment that's a deterrent. It's the knowledge that you've got a very good chance of being caught, which in South Africa doesn't exist really.
Exactly. We even looked at studies a few years ago about the penalties, the type of penalties. But when you speak to the individuals concerned, they tell you it's such a low risk for them being caught. That's why they commit the crime. It's irrespective of how many years you're going to get if you do get caught, because they also believe that if they are caught, they would be able to buy themselves out of the problem as such with corruption. And when we did a study in cash and transit robberies about 4 or 5 years ago, one of my colleagues, Dr. Henny Lochner, interviewed the incarcerated CIT robbers in prison. We found that in one specific case, an individual was arrested 16 times, 16 times, for being involved in cash and transit robberies, different robberies. He's never been to court. Every time the docket would disappear, witnesses would disappear, and they now allege to us when we speak to them in prison that they actually are able to bribe also the prosecutors now, as well as the presiding officers. So it's a big problem that we're facing.
You?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that. Years ago, when Cobus was still presenting a different program, I was on one of them with Harold Parkendorf. And Parkendorf used to say that if you're looking for job security, don't work in the civil service. Don't work at universities or Anglo-American. That's not job security. Crime is the real job security, because your chances, like we've just heard, are very slim to be caught. And secondly, once you're in the court system, by the court's own admission, they've got a percentage of cases, winning cases of less than 10%. So that is serious job security, being in crime. But that is just tongue-in-cheek. Rolf, can I ask you about the decline in transit robberies, bank robberies, and those kind of things? At one point, a year or two ago, it was like a pandemic. And do I understand the statistics correct, that has been in decline?
Yeah, you're quite right. I also work with the banks as far as these stats are concerned, and I can confirm that they're actually true. You would see that bank robberies is about 0 at the moment. It's very, very low. But it's crime displacement. It's not crime prevention. So what it means is it becomes so difficult for these people to commit these specific type of robberies, they would move on to another type of robbery. But the success factor here is the involvement of the private industry themselves. They would use the best intelligence available, but they also have very good skilled people who would deal with the problem. They would come up with prevention strategies that are actually successful. So yeah, it's crime displacement, and with the cash and transit robbery, it's actually a small number of people involved, small number of crimes compared to others. So it's easier to suppress these type of crimes.
I want to go back for a moment to the level of violence involved here. We didn't quite finish that. Why such brutality when you simply can go in, get what you want, and leave? But it seems that there's another element here, and it must be some sort of social element involved. Also, when I look at the fact that among the murders here and so on, we've seen an escalation in kids murdering kids.
Yeah, that's a very difficult one. We are often faced with this specific question. I think as far as violence is concerned, people want to try and label it and say it's a political motive or it's this type of motive. But the basic seems to be, if you speak to these incarcerated offenders, they tell you that they only, when they were in prison, realized what did they actually do to a fellow human being. Asking obviously the question, how did they then see the victim at the time? So I think within our bigger society, we have a problem with sensitivity for other people. We see this play out in the type of crime that's committed in South Africa. But I think one needs to be very careful not to label this and say, okay, this is a political motive to it or whatever. If you speak to the people that are sentenced, they tell you they use violence as a tool. They use this tool to make sure people would actually point out everything to them in the premises as far as valuables are concerned. They've learned through experience that people do not keep everything in one spot, not even in a safe. And violence is a tool to them. But we've got a huge problem within our community in how we perceive each other.
Cobus, I just want to say one thing, and I've said it so many times before on other platforms, and that is that there was I read a comparison of violent crime throughout the world. And they tried to, in some other way, map patterns that underlie violent crime. And if you look at, for instance, violent crime in South Africa, and you look at violent crime in parts of Brazil, and you look at violent crimes in Harlem in New York, they tried to identify certain things that are typical in all these different areas. And one of the things that they have identified is that in South Africa, 63% of all children grow up in a household where there's one adult. And in almost half of those cases, that adult is not the biological parent. In other words, people grow up in fractured households. And then if you live in extreme poverty, you experience your whole existence as a form of violence. And the way that you get access to resources of survival is a form of a zero-sum contest, and you tend to identify people as insiders and outsiders, and you learn all sorts of opportunistic ways to survive. And all those things seem to appear in different places in the world, different countries in the world. If you create the same conditions, you have higher pregnancies, teenage pregnancies, you have higher cases of rape, higher types of extreme violence. The social conditions seems to form a pattern in which these things appear. And that's why I think that's why we said it's not always, it's difficult to say it's political. It's political in the sense that it's sociological, and that is the conditions under which certain people live, create, call it the psychology of violence, where violence is not necessarily justified, but it becomes a way of living, a means of living. And I think there's enough stats and data to show that the societies with a solid family structure tend to have lower levels of violence. Middle-class societies don't have the same levels of violence as unemployed people, and it's got to do with the sociology of the social structure, I think.
Rudolf?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot to say about what Piet said. The majority of people in South Africa grow up without a proper parenthood, without the proper structure that one would expect would be there for everyone. It's not. And yeah, quite right. Rightfully said. Also, we have a huge problem with violence becoming the norm within specific societies. People operate in a specific way within those societies, and it becomes a tool for them to get what they want. And I think we become desensitized to each other as far as you're a victim and so on. But it's a bigger issue that we need to deal with. And I think we need to be very careful of not putting this into a political box or saying this is specifically framed within a specific community. It's across the board. I have found that it doesn't matter what the color of the person is that you're speaking to during an interview in prison. If they committed these violent crimes, they were as violent as any other ethnical group would have been. So yeah, there's some mechanism in South Africa that's taking place that would make these people become very violent. But one of the theories is, and I'm not a criminologist, I'm a criminalist, I'm more a practitioner, but one of the theories is that we are so exposed to violence as a mean of surviving in South Africa that we tend to live this out also as far as crime is concerned.
Theo?
One question, Rudolf. Any use of alcohol or other kind of things when they commit these crimes? In other words, is there a way in which they prepare themselves psychologically to do what they're doing?
Yeah, it's interesting. We found that some of them would use some form of drug, but the majority of them said, especially with the let's call it more advanced crimes, the cash and transit robberies and so on, they would make absolutely sure that none of the members were taking drugs at the time of committing the crime, not taking alcohol, etc. They explained it also, saying that they've learned through experience. If you take somebody that's intoxicated to a crime scene, they would go beyond what they would consider to be necessary to be able to commit the crime. If they then would exceed a specific norm, let's say rape also the victims, then the police would pay more attention to that specific case. So for them, it was important to control this in the crime, but for a very practical reason.
But now we...
Are you done, Cobus? Are we out of time?
Continue, fine.
I think it's almost like the militarization of the phenomenon. In a military context also, you have to be rather sober. You use just enough violence, and you try to get in and out as effectively as possible. And then, of course, the other thing is that people who consume alcohol and who use drugs, they are easier to extract information from later. And you will see that the cash and transit robberies, they always get away, and it's very rare for somebody to get shot in that. They want to be in and out, and they don't want the police to pay too much attention to it. And almost never you get the money back. And that's partially because of the way I think that they function. If they killed several people, if they raped a few people at the scene, it's very likely that there would have been a bigger hunt for them, and very likely that some of them would have been arrested. But I think also, if I might be wrong, but I think the police had some success lately with arrest of some of these cash and transit robbers.
We've run out of time, really, but I just need to end off here by getting back to the point made earlier on. So that when we look at crime and the high levels of crime, Rudolf, that we have in South Africa, one gets the idea more and more that this is much more of a social problem than anything else, and that the solutions lie elsewhere, as Piet described there. That we've got to look at family structures, we've got to look at the way kids are being raised in this country, what they're being exposed to, and how their lives are built from a very young age. So this is a long-term problem, and we're not going to solve it in the next couple of years.
No, definitely not. I think one needs to understand that policing is never going to stop crime in South Africa. It's going to be the society, the bigger society. I also work within the schools and so on. And we will have to look at the values of people and how to educate people to behave in a specific way. Policing is the last stop. If you get to policing, you've actually already failed as far as the society is concerned. And yeah, we have to look at better ways of understanding how to deal with crime within our societies, but also look at the norm and values of our societies and how they perceive others, because that seems to be the problem. They would, within their own group, justify to say, I can go and commit a crime or robbery against somebody else who's not similar to what I am. And I'm not talking about skin color. I'm talking about living another way and so on. So a lot of education that is required within our system.
Now, we have to end there. Unfortunately, I want to thank Rudolf Zinn, Professor Rudolf Zinn of UNISA. Thank you so much for your participation in our program this afternoon. And also to my panel members, Piet Kroukamp and Theo Venter. Thank you so much. We'll do it again. My name is Cobus Bester. We say goodbye until 5 o'clock next week on ilovemelville.live. Bye-bye.